Bobby, it's always so amazing to be with you. You're looking better and better every day. I'm not sure what you're drinking, what kind of coffee you've got. Let's start off today's call with a little coffee toast.
Yeah, here we go.
uh, you know, our first call, we talked about recruiting, and you shared some really good tips and strategies around coaches surrounding themselves with the best people possible. You know, you're really big on character and keeping winning and losing in perspective. Today, we're going to shift and turn coffee with coaches into a sort of master class. You know, in your book, Cross-Court Reflections, you have a great line, and it's so simple. You say, life is a team game. Let's build off of that and just kind of see where we go on team building.
Sure. Well, one of the things we did each year was when I got to Notre Dame, I got into practice of, we started the year off with a cookout at my house. Sometimes we'd have the women's team join us. Sometimes they might have had another commitment that weekend or what have you, but it was a big backyard, and the kids would play softball or whatever and run around and act like they were athletes. And we cook out some burgers and hot dogs and sit around and just get to know each other, because I think it's important for them to know me more than just as the guy that comes to the courts every day. And then my wife would always have a spaghetti dinner at the beginning of indoor practice at our house. And there were several things like that we did. Another thing that really helps that is I used to, these are all things I learned to do over time, but I wanted the team to know each other. And so I would, sometimes in practice, we would have, I would call it, and your old friend Greg Patton used to call it outhouse to the penthouse, where you start on a lower court, and if you win, you move up, and you keep going till you get to the end, and you're in the penthouse. We would start practice with that, and little baseline games or one serve games, things to emphasize certain things, or and then I would add bonus points if you win the point at the net or what have you. But in order to start off the initial where you were, whether you were in the penthouse or down in the outhouse, I asked trivia questions. And it might be, which teammate has 3 sisters, or which teammate's father does this, and it forced them, they were all, oh, I didn't know your dad did this, and I didn't know that. And I asked things about my family, and so they started paying attention, and they got to know each other better. And I really think that helps. And I think I told you this before, but another thing I did that became pretty important is I tried to ask every player a question or two, or begin a little bit of a conversation that had something to do with their life outside of tennis. How things at home, are you still thinking of switching to major? How's your sister doing at such and such a school? Those kind of things, because I didn't want to them to think that their value to me was how good they were.
How'd you develop this approach? Did you experience it as an athlete yourself, even before you got into coaching, in terms of building some of those connections?
Not really. Most of the things I did were learn as you go, when I was in college, our coach had a lot of other responsibilities, and some days he couldn't even be there. And so we actually ended up growing real close. A bunch of us are still in touch. We still get together. Whenever I go back to Richmond, we all get together and have dinner and have a couple of beers and talk about how great we were.
Not how great you are, how great you were.
Right. By now, we were all serving at 150 and, that kind of thing. It goes up a little bit every year. But I just, over time, realized it. And then I know this, and I can't remember if I mentioned this last time or not, But when I first started coaching, I read all the, Vince Lombardi was a big coach in football, and John Wooden was a big name in basketball. And so I read all the books about those kind of people. And at 24 years old, well, how would Vince handle this situation? Or how would John Wooden handle this situation? And after a while, it dawned on me, well, I'm not Vince Lombardi and I'm not John Wooden. That's when I started to figure out how I needed to handle things. We talked about just being yourself as a big part of that, but all of those things go in to create the culture. And as you know, you never know what's going to hit you each day in the coaching world. You go to work and all of a sudden there's a player sitting in your office at 8 o'clock in the morning waiting for you. And his dad had just died, or this had happened, or that had happened, or and they didn't really come to me and talk about their love lives too much, which was a good thing. But we ended up, becoming much better friends through that process.
Yeah, it's funny, how you brought up the being yourself. And I mean, it's tough to build a great culture as a coach if you're still trying to find your way, right? And, and not leading from the core of who you are. And it's a process for all of us. You mentioned the general Greg Patton earlier. And as you know, I started my career with Greg out at Boise State. And, Bobby Knight was someone that I looked up to just in terms of the results that he created with Indiana basketball. But as most sports people know, he was a pretty tough love approach.
Taskmaster.
Total taskmaster. I think the book that he wrote was titled The Power of Negative Thinking, right? So one day I decided that I'd do my best Bobby Knight routine during practice with one of our guys. And I had great relationships with all the guys because at the time I was 23, 24 years old. I was a GA. I was hanging out with the guys on the weekends, and Greg, at one point, Greg was like, you really need to decide whether you want to be a coach or you want to be a player. I'll leave that up to you. So it took some time, but I ripped into this guy. I undressed him publicly, and I don't know what I was thinking. I definitely didn't know who I was as a coach at that time. And it fractured our relationship for a time. Sure. And it should have. But I think what I remember the most was I learned after that the women's coach had a recruit and her parents on the side who they were doing a campus visit and witnessed the entire altercation, so to speak. And you learn your lesson when you experience something like that. I was like, I don't think Bobby Knight is maybe the persona that I want to put on right now. I don't think that I'm ready for that. But the being yourself and just kind of working out those kinks, it takes time. Bobby, how do you define team culture? I mean, there's a lot of books written on culture. What does that look like to you?
It's really kind of the environment in which you want your team to be. And it could be plenty of coaches are more results oriented, and a number of them are more, they almost like they want to be a player. And I think you have to find out where you are. There have to be guidelines and lines not to cross and so forth. And it takes most people a while to figure that out. I do know that when I first started coaching at Navy, I was 24 and my seniors were 22. And so we, in another world, we'd be double dating together or something. But I was more of a martinet, more of a taskmaster, because I felt it necessary to build a wall, and so they would understand I wasn't there just to be their friend. And I honestly, as I look back, I didn't have, we had a good experience, but it wasn't fun for me. I had some really good some really good players that when they became seniors a couple of years later, and we had established by my first year, we were lucky to have a over 500 record, and it was aided by 2 forfeit wins by Yale and Princeton because they were protesting the Vietnam War and canceled our match. But by my second or third year, we had gotten to the point where we'd beaten Harvard and some of the better Eastern teams, and were pretty good. And that group graduated. And so the next year I had much lower expectations of the team. And in having those expectations, I became probably a lot more patient and understanding. And I ended up really having fun. And I realized this is who I am, and this is the way I want it to be. And from now on, we're not going back to that other way. So a lot of trial and error from my end. And again, not having a mentor as a coach that had a system that I could follow, I had to create it all myself. And I asked a lot of questions. The senior coaches that I respected, I picked their brains all the time. And most of us in coaching actually appreciate when someone comes up and asks you that, because you went through that yourself. So I don't know if that answered your question or not, but that in terms of culture, you've got to find out what you want it to be, and every now and then you're going to have a team that just doesn't seem to fit, and you can't figure out why. And maybe it's because 2 or 3 of the players don't like some of the other guys, and you don't even know. But you want it to be to the point where the kids will come and talk to you about it if there's a problem.
You reminded me of the time when I spent 10 weeks at Stanford working with Dick Gould and John Whitlinger. And, I had the good fortune of interviewing Gould while I was out there. And the first thing he said in response to, basically like, how do you do what you do? Like, you're winning championships almost every year, right? And I'm bringing Dick into the conversation because, in our first call, you mentioned at the end, just, what an outstanding job Dick Gould does. And he really continues to do, even though he's not currently the head coach at Stanford now. But he said, we strive to create a positive learning environment, period. And for me, that's always been the definition of culture, just a positive learning environment. And I thought that this would be a good opportunity for you to share a little bit of what you observed having competed against Stanford and Coach Gould, and how he built up that culture year after year after year, and maybe some takeaways for coaches and leaders that, that are listening and or watching this today.
Well, it became pretty obvious that he was the guy that you really needed to watch. And at first, it was looking from afar. I was at Navy. We didn't play Stanford. We were an East Coast team. We weren't a contender for the NCAA championship. I had some pretty good teams there that finished in the top 25-ish in the NCAA tournament, which used to be just a singles and a doubles tournament, and you counted up the number of wins to give you a team score. But when I came to Notre Dame, I had bigger ideas, bigger plans in terms of how good I thought we could be, and anytime I had around Dick, I just watched how he handled things. One of the great, and the thing about Dick is he could beat you and and you'd walk away feeling like you enjoyed it, because you wouldn't get mad at him. But the first year we got invited to the NCTC national tournament out in California. It was in Palm Springs, and they invited the top 8 teams, and they each brought 4 players, and it was an individual tournament. And I took my wife, Pat, and so we were in line for a buffet dinner, and Dick came up to me and whispered in my ear, and he said, "Bobby, I've forgotten your wife's name." Now, he had never met my wife, but rather than say, "I don't know your wife, can you tell me her name?" he tried to couch it a little better. And so I told him, and then he walked away and sat down. 15 minutes later, we're at the dinner table, and he walks over and "Hey, Pat, it's great to see you. I'm Dick Gould. I don't know if you remember me or not, but it's great to have you out here." But right away, she's a Stanford fan. And I'm glad to play him that year, because she'd have been rooting for them. So he just knows the right thing to say and do. And I'm sure it evolved for him, over time. But, if you really want to follow somebody and make sure that if you emulate them, you'll be successful, I can't think of anybody better.
Well, I know he has a book coming out shortly called The Anatomy of a Champion. And I think coaches across sports and at every level would do themselves well by, considering reading his book and getting more familiar with his work. Bobby, teams change every year, right? So I want to sort of dig into how you approached goal setting for your teams on a year-to-year basis. Because I'm facing that right now. I mean, we came off the most successful season in the history of McKendree Tennis, and you realize the day after the season ends that it's already record books, and now it's time to look forward, and you have a different mix of players. So how did you approach goal setting and sort of setting the vision for what you wanted to achieve on a yearly basis?
Well, I found, and I'm not sure how it is now. I haven't coached for 10 years, but the key was, if you had a strong schedule, you got opportunities to play people. And in those days, only 20 teams made the NCAA tournament, so it was tough. And there were always at least 4 from regions where they wouldn't have gotten in, but each of the 8 geographic regions sent a team. So you had to be close to maybe number 12 or 13 in the country to get in as an at-large. And so getting to know the territory was important. And I remember the year we got to the NCAA finals. That's the first year that I really thought we could do well. My first team was we didn't play a very good schedule, and we weren't that talented. I had a dynamic team leader in Brian Calbus, and he helped enormously. But we just kind of got through the season, and I learned what it was like to be in the Midwest and who the coaches were and the people. And then the next year we brought in David DeLucia and Walter Delari, and I remember thinking, wow, we're ready to go. Well, no, I didn't bring in too many other people, so we still had some issues. But my third year, we were, I think we finished the year ranked 16. We were 24-3, but we didn't get into the tournament because of again, I was a newcomer and so forth. My fourth year, we played everybody. We opened with SMU with Dennis Ralston and Georgia as our first 2 matches. And we just kept going, and we played a lot of the better teams. We played Southern Cal and UCLA out there on spring break. And we lost some matches, but we beat a few of those good teams, and we ended up in the top 20, and we made the tournament and got to the let's see, I think we won our first round, got to the second round. Then the next year, after having played all those teams, was the first year I thought, we might be a Final Four team, or if it depends on the draw. You don't want to get Stanford in the second round. And that year we got to the finals. And I do remember Jerry Simmons, the LSU coach, and Kent Morris were good buddies. And they came up to me afterwards and said, okay, now you got there. You got to near the top of the mountain. Now the tough part comes, maintaining. It's much harder to maintain than it is to get there. And they were right. One of the things that helped was that now that once we reached the NCAA final and played for a national championship on the last day of the season, at least people would get a letter from me or a phone call and have some interest. And so I was able to start recruiting better players. And what happened was a lot of the players that we had gotten who became All-Americans and really good players, the people at that level were afraid they might not play. And and the really good, the top 3, 4, 5 players, at least would begin getting interested and would take a visit. And so I was recruiting the very best players in the country. And but it would come down to right at the end, it would be hard to get those guys away from Stanford, UCLA, or USC. And so in terms of figuring out how good we would be and what our goals would be, I just had a schedule, tried to play a schedule that was as difficult as possible with the most opportunities. And I learned over time not to anticipate being here at a certain point of the season or being ranked here. Obviously, we'd all like to be ranked as high as possible, but I learned that what was really important was how you played at the end of the year at the tournament. And so if you were prepared, I really didn't worry about that as much. Now, did I watch the rankings every week when they came out? Absolutely.
Who doesn't?
So I'm really lying to you, but I tried to tell myself, I knew deep down inside that wasn't important. That was window dressing, but I still was seduced by it a little bit. And but I think you just, in my case, you just try to play the best teams you can, and then in one of those years when it all goes your way, you'll have a great year. And I tried not to get too hung up over the rankings.
Well,
I don't know if that answered the question.
Yeah, I mean, please. You not only answer the question, you over deliver, with your answers. Tennis and rankings, it's sort of like a harsh market reality. I mean, you need to pay attention to that stuff, but like you said, not get too caught up in it, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, this past season, we were getting great results from the beginning of the spring season for the first couple of months, but the rankings, it took so long for the rankings with the way the points system runs for us to actually get the recognition. It wasn't until the very last rankings that came out at the end of the season that we broke the top 25. So you can't get too hung up on that. Obviously, we all want to be as high as we can be. You touched on something. You said, it's tougher to maintain success, right? I mean, the key is to sustain rather. It's tougher than the actual climb, right? There's challenges that are inherent to, to getting into that upper echelon, so to speak.
Right.
What do you see as some of the most common challenges and obstacles to building a great team culture? Like, what can really get in the way and just sort of make it a no-go? Like it's not going to happen.
one of the problems you can have is a problematic player. And every once in a while, I would have a guy on my team that really didn't fit in, and maybe had a bad temper and did things in practice, and would you really, that didn't represent what you wanted. And some of the players would resent that person, and others might befriend him and think I was being too hard on him. And another thing in terms of that, I know once at Navy, I had a very good player who was playing number one for us, and I'd known him for a long time. We're from the same hometown, and knew his brother, and a lot of the players thought that there were a couple guys that thought they should be number one, and he was clearly our best player. But I started to realize that there was a little bit of a team problem. They thought I was playing favorites. So it reached the point one day where I pulled him aside and said, right before practice started, "Don't be offended. I'm going to throw you out of practice today." And he said, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "Well, I'm aware that X person and Y are complaining. They think you're getting favorable treatment. You and I know that isn't true, but this will just, maybe it'll help that situation a little bit." And so the first thing he did, where he showed a little temper or something, I overreacted and actually kicked him out of practice. And he acted hurt and walked away upset. And right away, those other guys, now he became one of them. He was a good guy, and they could be friendly with him. And again, I didn't read that in a book. I just thought it would be the right way to handle that situation. So, I think you're always trying to test the water and get the temperature and see where your team is, and be thinking, what can I do? Do we need a hard practice today? Do we need an easy practice? For 3 months, I think it was about 5 years after I retired, our women's assistant left suddenly in February and left a big hole. And we had hired a brand new women's coach, Allison Silverio. And where was she going to find someone in the middle of the season to come in? And so I walked in the building one day to see Ryan Satry, our head men's coach. And she grabbed me and said, "When you get finished, come see me. I'd like to talk to you." Well, I came back to see her, and she said, "Well, so-and-so is gone, and we're really in a bind. So is there any way you would consider filling in for him for the rest of the season?" And it definitely was not what I was expecting. And I remember thinking, I'd never coached women. I coached a woman professional player, but never coached a women's team. And I ended up saying yes. And I watched the way she did things. One thing she did that was really neat one day was, we finished a practice, and about 15 minutes early, and she said, "Okay, everybody pile in the cars." And a couple of the kids had cars right there. And she drove everyone to this place here in South Bend that makes really, really delicious cookies. And she bought cookies for everybody. I remember thinking, what a good idea. I never did that, but so there's a lot of ways to skin a cat. And I think the more people you talk to, the more great ideas you'll get.
How did you deal with the potential of complacency within your teams? Because you started to, well, you really got things going at Notre Dame pretty quickly. At least that's my understanding within your couple seasons there. And you had to keep raising the bar, because I would think that complacency is a pretty common potential obstacle for teams that are committed to performing at the highest level.
Yeah, what I found out was we didn't have to worry about it with the first teams that got good. And our NCAA finalist team in '92 only had one senior that traveled, David DeLucia, and the rest were mostly juniors. We had a large number of people in that class that were pretty good players. And so he graduated, and that was a huge loss. He was number one in the country his senior year. But the other guys really picked up the slack, and we had two of the other guys made All-America that next year. And that team did very well. And as I look back on it, they were part of the building process. So they knew what hard work it took, and they weren't about to relinquish what they'd worked hard for. And then the teams that followed that, there were a couple of times where we really didn't achieve much. We were in the top 20 for about 6 or 7 straight years. And then I know in '96, we had a group of seniors that were pretty good, but they had come in right after the beginning of that process. And I remember that team didn't play well, and we really underachieved. And I still look back and think I should have done some things differently. But once we had that bad year, where I think we finished in around 30-ish, then the very next year we jumped right back in with a bunch of new guys. Again, they were all part of the building process. And so you've got to get to the point where if you smell your underarms, you don't think it smells good. You got to realize it stinks. And I think that that's as big a part of it as everything. As long as there are enough people that can remember when they weren't eating filet mignon, it was hamburgers and hot dogs, that as long as they have some memory of that, it keeps it at a high level.
So we're entering what I call the fifth set of our conversation this week. And I'd like to ask you to imagine that you're at the head of a classroom and you got the chalkboard there. The chalk is in your hands, and in the audience you have all kinds of athletes. You've got coaches from every sport. You may have some business leaders, some CEOs sprinkled in the audience because they heard how amazing Coach Bayliss is, and they came to get some insights from cross-court reflections. And the question on the board reads, what are your top 3 strategies for building a championship culture? What would you put on that chalkboard for those people?
Okay, the first one would be to develop a great work ethic. And you do that simply by working hard and making sure that the players work hard. The second thing would be to make sure that you always understand they're a team and you're part of a team. And you do that by constantly referencing things that bring them together. As I told you, we used to do little trivia questions. If you want to start on the first court, okay, who did this, or whose father did that, or whose mother, and make sure, or who's majoring in this and is overloaded, whatever. That really helps to bring them together. And the third thing would be keep your antenna up all the time, because you never know when the next storm is brewing. Someone could have a personal problem. Someone could have a health issue. I once, had found out a player had a really severe personal problem. I don't think we talked about this in the last interview, and so cut me off if I did, but one that I've always remembered was I had a really good player that I liked a lot, Bobby Phillips at the Naval Academy, and he was a team captain his senior year. And one day we were playing a fairly insignificant match. We were winning very easily. He was having all kinds of personal problems. I mean, yelling, screaming, very uncharacteristic. He broke a racket, and finally I ended up defaulting him, walking out on the court and shaking the other guy's hand. And here was the team captain, and he was really upset with me. I told him to go into the locker room. I'd be there in 5 minutes. And I saw his close friend was watching the match, and I told him, get in there and get with him and calm him down, because I'll be there in 5 minutes. So I walked in, and the locker room was shambles. The lockers had been overturned. There were pieces of his racket, and the wooden racket in those days were all over the place. And I suddenly remembered that he had been a Golden Gloves boxer. And I thought, uh-oh. and he looked at me, and he walked right up to me, inches away from my face, and I thought he was going to hit me. And he just started crying, put his arms around me, and just bawled on my shoulder. What I didn't know was his dad was undergoing a serious operation that day, life-threatening, and he had wanted to be there, and I certainly would have allowed him to go home for that. But his mother wanted him to stay where he was and told him to stay there, and I didn't know any of this was going on. And so right away, I figured everything out pretty quickly, and I could have certainly avoided the whole thing had I known. My antenna wasn't up quite as high as it should have been. And never let your guard down that way. Always be looking for things. So that would be probably number 3.
Develop a great work ethic, always understand your team. So constantly bring them together in creative ways. That's going to vary, coach to coach and context to context in terms of the university. And keep your antenna up all the time. That's a great tweet. If I was on Twitter, I would tweet that, but I'm not on Twitter. But we'll make sure we get that up on the video blog. Hey, Bobby, thanks so much. This was great. I know that coaches and leaders are going to get a lot of value from the stories and the strategies you shared today.
Thank you, René. Appreciate it.